This is a timeline of the most important recessions in history. Wait, oops, that's not the one. Okay, that's right. It's almost funny to see how each one of them is just a repeat of the same cycle. It's the same players abusing power, making the same mistakes, and the losers just always the regular folks, people who had no idea what was going on. For example, all of these recessions were caused by government or its lack of preparedness for external forces. All of these were caused by failures in the financial system, and all of these were caused by greedy millionaires and speculators just playing dice with the economy. But so many of them started here. And depending on where you lean politically, you might think that the culprit is like a lack of government oversight or too much intervention. And you might be right, but you shouldn't just echo what media says.
Recessions are caused by unpredictable events that lead to severe disruptions.
Recessions are part of our business cycle. Supply shock, demand shock, geopolitical issues that come about.
Will it be a recession or will it be a bad recession?
Recessions always start with an economy that's been booming.
I do believe recessions are really inevitable.
You should judge these stories yourself and just know the facts and draw your own conclusions. So here's every single recession in history. We traveled tens of thousands of miles on this video. You'll see in a sec. And the only reason we can get away with that is because we're not just a YouTube channel. Like, Slidebean is a SaaS subscription business. We've been running for 8 years now. And through all of those 8 years, the backbone of our metrics has been ChartMogul, our sponsor for today. They have what I believe one of the most powerful, the most intuitive, and the best designed SaaS tracking tool out there. At Slidebean, we use them to track where our customers come from, how long they stay with their plans, retention by region, even revenue that doesn't come from subscriptions. It's super intuitive, everybody in the team has access and they can use it to see how their work impacts our revenue. If you're just starting out and you use the link that we put in the description, ChartMogul will be free for you if you have under $10,000 in monthly subscriptions. And after that, you'll get a $600 credit compared to their usual plan price. ChartMogul supports our channel and they help us make these videos. And if you check them out, they'll keep doing it and we'll keep making them.
I'm done. I want out.
It's just money.
The 1796 recession in the US is like this cookie-cutter model for so many others. It's also one of the first scares for America as a country, and it involved one of the founding fathers who ended up in jail. So the setup is the end of the Revolutionary War. That's the one where American colonies rebelled against the British. And so the Brits had claimed all the land all the way to the Mississippi River. Now it technically belonged to the former US federal government. But speculators started buying up these vast lands. The government needed money, it was cheap, uninhabited land, and it was obviously gonna grow in value as more settlers eventually came in. And I'm gonna go back to that. Now, over on the east, Washington, D.C. was under construction, the capital of this new country, and these three clever guys figured that they could also purchase some land there, and that it was also gonna appreciate quicker. They formed the North America Land Company, and by 1793, they owned 40% of all the land of what is now D.C. And to buy up all this land, they wanted to raise money from European investors, but Europe was concerned with some other guys. So to keep funding this expansion, they started issuing their own banknotes, their own currency. Yeah, it was backed by all the Western lands that they had purchased. At this time, we had a first bank of the United States. It existed. It's the equivalent of a central bank, but there was no established currency in the country. Each bank was able to issue their own banknotes. And this was very weird, but definitely legal. And there were other land speculators around. They were not the only ones. But North American Land Company, co-founded by Morris, who was a founding father, was respected and trusted enough to issue its own currency.
Tax-free and backed by the full faith and credit of the sovereign Sandia Republic.
But the war in Europe and other factors were causing a lot of businesses to go belly up around 1796, and some land speculators started landing in jail because of their debt, including this guy, who was an associate U.S. Supreme Court justice. Now, a rumor spread that Robert Morris was in jail as well, and that was the trigger. By this point, the North American Land Company had issued 10 million Morris dollars, the equivalent of $232 million in today's money. And so the company and all other land speculation schemes started imploding. The recession hit coastal cities especially hard, with shopkeepers and artisans and wage laborers just taking the biggest hit and going out of business. But luckily, we learned some really good lessons from this thing. For example, avoiding these proto-currencies, like currencies that are not regulated by a central bank. And we learned never to do it again. Okay, so now cue that video that we liked.
1637, 1797, 1819, 29, 1937, 1974, 97, 2000, and whatever we want to call this. It's all just the same thing over and over. We can't help ourselves.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so proto-currencies were part culprit for the 1819, the 1837, the 1857, and the 1873 panics. Real estate speculation was at the core of the 1819 crisis, the 1837, the 1873, and of course the 2009 real estate crisis. Perhaps the biggest lesson here for this young America was how interconnected world economies were, which 1796 Americans understandably didn't get very well, but that's a lesson that took way longer for other people to learn. The 1857 crisis was directly caused by this global dependence, and 200 years later, they learned the same lesson here in Iceland, where the three biggest banks in the country imploded. These banks were over-leveraged, they overreached, they had too many loans that they could not afford to pay when the 2009 crisis hit.
Begging Russia for a loan of almost $5.5 billion.
The primary concern is the sustainability of the banking system, as well as the best interest of the Icelandic people.
But for Iceland, this crisis meant riots and a toppled government, people went to jail, and the country's currency was severely devalued, which silver lining helped spike Iceland as a tourist destination during the 2010s. Part of the reason we're here.
I can't really talk right now. I'm on my way to a volcano.
By the way, we didn't fly me here just for this shot. I had a layover and I just couldn't help myself. But by the way, on this little timeline that we'll make as we eventually edit this video, we have the symbol which references how severe each crisis was. In our scale of, say, wallet wobble to holy economic apocalypse Batman. The 2009 recession, that's a 5 out of 5. But the Great Depression in 1929, I think it deserves a category of its own.
Every time America has had a panic in the past, it has paid people to buy stocks in the midst of the excitement.
In 2009, even with countries like Iceland and the US on the verge of collapse, worldwide GDP saw a 1% decrease. But between 1929 and 1932, worldwide GDP decreased by 15%. Let me tell you why.
Stock prices plummeted cyclically across the board, spurring the rush of sell orders from terrified speculators. Still more.
So we're coming out of the 20s and it's crazy times. This is a post-war boom. Ford invents the car, and there's wood and rubber and steel industries growing in the US and in Europe. And the US economy doubled in size from 1920 to 1929. And who was funding this growth? Loans, of course, and banks. So farmers took out mortgages to pay for equipment and to expand their land. Factories expanded and they hired people to ramp up production. So the entire US economy doubled in size, but it had done so using credit. And the US was printing money like crazy to keep up with all of these activities. And with so much money on the street, people wanted to invest. This time, not on real estate, but on this cool little gamble they play here called stocks. Millionaires and cooks and janitors, they all ran to put their money, their life savings, into the stock market. And banks wanted a piece of this, but since banks can't technically invest in the stock market, they found a workaround to get into the game. They would lend people money so that they would invest in the stock market. And this new creative instrument was called margin trading, and they did a lot of it. You could essentially borrow 90% of the money to buy stocks. For example, say you wanted to buy an Apple share worth $180, you only really needed $18, and the bank would lend you the rest. And so when the bank had lent all their money, they'd borrow from another bank to just keep playing the game. And the party was never going to stop. Customers' debts were backed by stocks, this very stable thing that never ever changes in value drastically. And those were solid and not inflated at all, right? Because from 1922 to 1929, the Dow grew by 220%. People were really investing in this thing, and they were doing it with money that they didn't really have. And the US did have a central bank by now, and they were scared of, wait for it, they were scared of inflation. So they decide, you know where this is going, they decide to raise interest rates. And weird things happen when interest rates go up so drastically.
Wait, inflation is the problem, so the Fed just made other things more expensive?
They managed to stop people from borrowing, all right, but people also started spending less, which meant less sales, which meant all that borrowed capital to ramp up production wasn't really getting paid, and it meant people started losing their jobs. And then, of course, those leveraged trades on the stock market suddenly start plummeting. And then banks can't collect their margin calls because people are unemployed and stocks are down, which means that they can't pay their own debts to the other banks. And there's this domino effect. On Black Tuesday alone, the stock exchange lost $14 billion. That's roughly $240 billion of today's money.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
In total, it's estimated that the crash cost $600 billion in losses in today's money. The stock market didn't stop plummeting until 1932. By then, the US market had lost 89% of its value. But outside of Wall Street, things were way worse. 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of a job, and this meant lines for basic goods, lines for food. The US government tried to fix things. They tried to make things better. So, for example, they tried putting tariffs on imported goods so that people would buy local groceries, local production, but they got slapped with retaliation tariffs instead. And have we seen this before?
Donald Trump has threatened to impose major new tariffs on cars imported to the US from the European Union. It comes on the same day that EU tariffs on iconic American goods came into effect.
By the end of this crisis in '39, over 60% of rural households and 82% of farm families were classified as impoverished, and they had nothing to do with what was going on here. And then by this time, the US was very much a developed economy, and it still saw hundreds of people die of hunger. Unemployment hit virtually every country in the world. It doubled in France and Germany, and they all had to find a way to cope. And the silver lining, a shopping holiday, which I wish was a joke, but isn't. But what did we learn? We learned to never again speculate on stocks. We learned to ban all margin trading altogether, and we learned to stop banks from over-leveraging their positions. And we learned that crazy stuff happens when you suddenly bump interest rates and what that does to the economy. We learned all that. No, in all seriousness, like there are a lot of factors that affect what interest rates can do, and even the top economists can't agree. But yeah, some similarities.
Many Americans are beginning to really feel the ripple effect of the Fed's interest rate
Today,
hike.
we took another step by raising our policy interest rate a quarter percentage point.
10th consecutive interest rate hike as the country tries to fight off inflation.
By the way, I've always wondered how much tech went into stock trading back in the 1920s. It worked like this. You would call your broker, who then would call the floor. They'd find a trader of that stock, and they would find the best possible price. And then once you got a price, then the purchase was made, and then the sale was recorded at the exchange, first in a slip of paper, and then handed to a keyboard operator who typed it in using the stock symbol. That's what they were used for. And then this got distributed using telegraph technology into these tickers, that these slips of paper, and you'd instantly, or I guess mostly instantly, know what happened, even if you were on the other side of the world. It is kind of like in the internet, I guess. But the first crisis to be arguably caused by the telegraph itself was the Panic of 1857. The first panic that we would consider a worldwide, or at least a Western-wide crisis.
Okay, it's happening. Everybody calm down!
So we're coming out of the gold rush. This is the 1850s. If you don't know, the gold rush gold was found in California, and about 300,000 people moved to the state to try and get their hands on some of it. And then the railroad was a key part of this. The railroads were a great business back then. Banks, again, started lending money to these entrepreneurs to build more railroads, but many of them never made it past what they called paper railroad companies. They never built a single line or owned a single train. Now, meanwhile, Dred Scott, who was a black slave, had sued for his freedom, and his case had made it all the way to the Supreme Court, but he lost. At that point, black people were not considered citizens, and therefore he couldn't really sue. But this decision also meant that the Supreme Court could not forbid slavery anywhere else in the US. And this was, of course, an issue, because people in the North, they didn't want to move to a state or to a region of the country where slavery is legal or allowed, which meant that this bubble of railroad investment and railroad stocks popped. Meanwhile, another factor, this bank, called the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, went belly up. And this news spread quickly thanks to the telegraph. But there's one other piece of the puzzle, and this is kind of like a Hollywood-style almost piece of the puzzle. Back then, getting from California to New York, even with this railroad infrastructure, was very slow. So the best way, the quickest and most efficient way to send gold from California to New York was through here in Central America. And this is a humble brag this time because I'm actually from here, but anyway, ship leaves California, and instead of going all the way around South America, they stop at Panama, offload the gold, ship it to the other side where the SS Central America would pick it up and then sail up north. And this is all a great plan until you come across a hurricane and sink and die. On September 12, 1857, the SS Central America sank off the coast of North Carolina with 300,000 pounds of gold, worth about $1 billion in today's money. Oh my God, it's like 30 degrees here. Oh Jesus. Continuity, man. This is continuity. Now, here in Great Britain, the cherry on top for this story is that the Brits have circumvented the gold standard. They didn't really call it the gold standard, they called it the Bank Charter Act of 1844, but it is somewhat the same thing. By the way, in a nutshell, the gold standard is a policy where money issued by banks must be backed by gold or by silver. In other words, each bank bill represents a certain amount of gold that the bank owns, and its values are tied together. And then the last factor was the end of the war in Crimea. And then here in Crimea, I'm just kidding. Not really Crimea, just a different background.
150 years ago, an army of British, French, and Turkish soldiers landed on Russia's southern shore.
The war in Crimea just ended, which meant that the Crimeans stopped buying American wheat. Like, they needed it before, they didn't need it anymore, which also really affected the US. Oh, and then by November that year, Napoleon was already tweeting, telegraphing about it. It's not the real Napoleon, this is like his nephew, Napoleon III, but yeah, they were concerned. And by the looks of this, it sounds like this crisis affected the investors and the banks, but that always trickles down to regular folks. Like, railroad companies shut down all over the country. Worker salaries were cut. Farmers could no longer make payments on their land, which cycles again into banks' domino effect. And banks failed across the pond, here in the US and in Great Britain. And even though this crisis doesn't rank so high in our scale, people still suffered. We learned some great lessons from this. We learned never to speculate on stocks, especially railroad stocks. Yeah, because that also caused the 73, the 84, the 93, and especially the 1901 crisis, where two billionaires tried to outbid themselves buying stocks on the Northern Pacific Railway, and it made Wall Street collapse. One of those guys was E.H. Harriman, and the other one we probably know by name. This was the first ever stock market crash, and that's probably the reason why Jeremy Irons brings it up.
1901 or 7. Jesus, didn't that fuck me up good?
But it only really ranks 2 out of 5 in our scale. It looks like it wasn't a big deal for average people, except small investors. They learned that it's really big investors who call the shots, who run the show, and that we are all at their mercy. And never ever again did some small investor gamble their life savings in the stock market. It's pretty crazy how speculation is just the common cause of all of these recessions. It's like we can't help ourselves. And this has been the story ever since the first one. So the first one was Tulip Mania, and we actually made a whole video about that one. Now that I think about it, I think we've made dedicated videos for a bunch. We did 2009 housing crisis, explained with Monopoly. We did the 2001 dot-com bubble with a much younger me, still one of our favorite videos. The last thing I have to ask is, do you want us to keep going? Let us know in the comments, and hit that red button if you want to watch the next one. See you next week.